Mercedes could lose up to 40 horsepower before the season even starts. The FIA has just scheduled a closed-door meeting before Test 2 in Bahrain. And the only topic is whether the 2026 Mercedes engine should be banned. Not investigated. Not reviewed. Banned. If the ruling goes against them, Mercedes will have roughly 72 hours to redesign the core of their power unit, or risk starting a brand new regulation era already half a second per lap behind. Ferrari is demanding a public verdict. Red Bull is threatening immediate protest. And insiders say the performance advantage could come from a microscopic expansion inside the engine, measured in microns, but worth championship-level speed. This is not a rumor anymore. This is an official meeting. And what happens before Test 2 could decide the balance of power for the entire 2026 era. Stay with me, because the technical detail at the center of this storm changes everything. The reason this escalated so quickly is simple. Rival teams believe Mercedes did not just build a strong engine. They built something fundamentally different. During the opening days of Bahrain testing, nothing looked dramatic on the surface. Mercedes was competitive, but careful. No flashy glory runs. No obvious statements. But inside the data rooms of Ferrari and Red Bull, engineers were focused on something far more precise than lap time. They were studying acceleration curves, corner exit traces, engine sound frequency. And that is where the first red flag appeared. Out of slow corners, the Mercedes-powered cars showed a sharp, almost violent torque delivery. Short, immediate, extremely efficient. Not the gradual build you would expect from a tightly regulated hybrid unit. And in this new era, electrical deployment is heavily standardized. So when the power looks different, the suspicion moves directly to the combustion engine. This is where the compression debate begins. Under the 2026 regulations, the internal combustion engine must operate with a maximum compression ratio of 16:1. That number was introduced for stability and cost control. 16:1 is supposed to be the ceiling. Clear, objective, measurable. And Mercedes passes inspection. Every time. Because the ratio is measured in static conditions. Cold engine. Controlled environment. Perfect geometry. But the theory circulating inside the paddock suggests something far more sophisticated. Mercedes is believed to have developed pistons made from a thermally reactive alloy. A material designed to expand aggressively when exposed to operating temperatures. When the engine is cold, the geometry complies perfectly. 16:1. No violation. But once the engine reaches full temperature, the pistons expand vertically by microscopic amounts. Microns. Tiny adjustments invisible to the naked eye. Yet enough to reduce the combustion chamber volume at top dead center, which effectively increases the compression ratio during actual track conditions. Not 16:1 anymore. Possibly 18:1. Maybe even 19:1 under peak load. And that difference changes everything. Higher compression extracts more energy from each combustion cycle. More energy means more torque. More torque means stronger acceleration. And in a formula where margins are measured in thousandths of a second, that is enormous. But here is the key detail most people overlook. Higher compression also improves thermal efficiency. That means better fuel consumption. Which means less starting fuel weight. Which means an additional performance gain layered on top of raw power. It compounds. Power. Efficiency. Weight reduction. All from a microscopic expansion measured in fractions of a millimeter. And when the engine cools after a session, the material contracts. Back to its original geometry. Back to compliance. Which makes the entire concept almost impossible to detect during standard scrutineering. If this theory is correct, it is not just clever engineering. It is strategic interpretation of the rulebook at the highest level. But that is only part of what triggered the FIA meeting. Because once Ferrari began suspecting dynamic compression behavior, they did not stop there. They started looking at fuel data. And that second layer of suspicion may be even more controversial. But we will get to that next. Because the fuel flow accusation could be the detail that forces the FIA to act immediately. But the fuel question is where this situation turns from clever to explosive. Because compression expansion can be argued as interpretation. Fuel flow manipulation cannot. Under the 2026 regulations, fuel flow is capped at 100 kilograms per hour. That limit is monitored by a standardized FIA sensor. It is supposed to be absolute, non-negotiable, flat. But here is the technical detail that opened the door to suspicion. The sensor does not measure fuel in a perfectly continuous stream. It samples in intervals, tiny fractions of time. Fast, but not infinite. And where there are intervals, there are gaps. Red Bull engineers reportedly began analyzing high-resolution telemetry and acoustic data from onboard recordings. Not just speed, not just throttle position, but the actual combustion sound signature during acceleration. And they believe they identified irregular pressure behavior inside the injection cycle. Very short surges, milliseconds in length, barely detectable, but synchronized with throttle application out of slow corners. The theory is this: if the injector system vibrates at a very high frequency, it can create micro-packets of increased fuel pressure. Instead of delivering fuel in a perfectly flat rate, it delivers it in pulses. Each pulse extremely brief. Each pulse potentially exceeding the permitted flow limit for a fraction of a second. Too short to trigger a standard over-limit reading, but long enough to generate a measurable torque spike. Now imagine combining that with higher dynamic compression. More fuel energy. More efficient combustion. More aggressive pressure inside the chamber. The result would be immediate power. Sharp acceleration. Exactly what rival teams claim to have observed in Bahrain. This is why Ferrari reportedly submitted detailed exhaust gas analysis to the FIA. Because combustion signatures leave traces. Pressure anomalies alter chemical output. And according to sources inside the paddock, Ferrari believes the exhaust profile of the Mercedes engine does not align with a strict 16:1 compression limit. They are not guessing. They are presenting data. And that data is what forced the FIA to act before Test 2. Because once a formal protest is filed at the start of a session, the consequences are immediate. Cars can be stopped. Programs can be frozen. Reputations can be damaged instantly. So the FIA chose to intervene preemptively. Schedule the meeting. Control the timeline. Contain the fallout. But here is the real tension. If the fuel flow system is cleared, it validates Mercedes' interpretation completely. If it is restricted, Mercedes must re-engineer not just pistons, but injection mapping and combustion strategy as well. And that cannot be done casually in 72 hours. That is months of calibration work. And here is what makes the moment even more fragile. Mercedes reportedly consulted the FIA about certain material behaviors many months ago. They believed they were operating within allowed boundaries. So from their perspective, this is not cheating. It is innovation. Which means if the FIA suddenly redefines the rule, Mercedes could argue regulatory inconsistency. And that opens the door to legal escalation. Not protest. Legal escalation. Now step back for a second. This is still pre-season. No championship points have been awarded. Yet 3 of the biggest manufacturers in the sport are potentially heading toward open conflict. And the second week of testing has not even started. Which raises the most important question of all. Why now? Why schedule this meeting before Test 2 instead of waiting for the first race? Because once the season begins, the political cost multiplies. Imagine banning an engine after points have been scored. After podiums. After sponsorship exposure. The consequences become chaotic. So the FIA is trying to draw a line early. Before the damage becomes irreversible. But that decision, whatever it is, will reshape the competitive order instantly. If Mercedes is forced to detune, they may lose up to half a second per lap. Half a second in modern Formula 1 is the difference between pole position and the third row. Between dominance and vulnerability. And if they are cleared completely, then every other manufacturer will begin searching for similar loopholes. Which means costs rise. Development accelerates. And the entire philosophy of the 2026 era begins to shift. This is no longer about one engine. It is about defining how far interpretation can go. And that is why Wednesday is not just a meeting. It is a turning point. Because once the FIA makes its choice, there is no going back. And the reaction inside the paddock could be even bigger than the decision itself. But here is where the pressure becomes almost unbearable. Because this is not happening in isolation. This is happening at the very birth of a new regulation era. 2026 was supposed to be different. Simpler power unit architecture. Greater electrical emphasis. Sustainable fuels. Cost stability. A reset for the sport. And instead, before the first race, we are staring at a potential engine ban. Now imagine the atmosphere inside Brackley right now. On the outside, confidence. Strong statements. Calm posture. But internally, this is red alert. Because if the FIA rules against them, Mercedes will have roughly 72 hours before Test 2 continues. 72 hours to modify a power unit concept that may have taken years to design. And it is not just about swapping pistons. If the compression behavior changes, ignition timing changes. If ignition timing changes, combustion stability changes. If combustion stability changes, turbo mapping changes. If turbo mapping changes, electrical deployment strategy changes. It is a chain reaction. And when you disrupt one element inside a modern hybrid engine, the ripple effect spreads everywhere. Vibration frequencies shift. Thermal loads redistribute. Reliability becomes unpredictable. You are no longer fine-tuning. You are surviving. That is why insiders believe Mercedes may already have a secondary specification prepared. A safer configuration. Slightly lower compression. More conservative mapping. Less controversial. But also less powerful. And here is the psychological element. If they are forced to run that safer version during Test 2, the paddock will notice immediately. Acceleration will look different. Top speed traces will flatten. Rival teams will smell vulnerability. And momentum in Formula One is everything. Because performance is not just mechanical. It is mental. Now consider the other scenario. The FIA clears the engine. Completely legal. No restriction. That may look like victory for Mercedes. But it would ignite something else entirely. Ferrari and Red Bull would not simply accept it quietly. They have already signaled the possibility of protest. Of escalation. Of challenging the interpretation beyond the FIA's internal structure. Which means even if Mercedes wins Wednesday, the championship could begin under legal shadow. And that is toxic for the sport. Sponsors hate uncertainty. Manufacturers hate instability. Fans hate championships decided off track. This is why Nicolas Tambatzis and the FIA leadership are under enormous strain. If they ban the engine, Mercedes could argue they followed the written regulation exactly as defined. If they allow it, they risk opening the door to an expensive material development war. Every manufacturer will begin researching aggressive thermal alloys, advanced micro-expansion geometries, dynamic fuel injection modeling. And suddenly the cost control philosophy of 2026 collapses. So the FIA is not simply judging legality. They are protecting the direction of the sport. And there is one rumored solution circulating quietly. A technical directive. Not an accusation. Not a punishment. A clarification. A dynamic compression limit slightly above 16:1. Framed as safety guidance. That would technically make Mercedes' configuration non-compliant going forward, without labeling it illegal from the start. It is political engineering. And even that would force Mercedes to adapt instantly. Which brings us to the final layer of this entire situation. Why did this surface now? Because rival teams were never going to wait until race 1. If Mercedes started the season with a hidden advantage, every race result would be questioned. Every podium debated. Every championship point contested. By scheduling this meeting before Test 2, the FIA is trying to contain the damage early. Draw a line before the grid forms. Before sponsors activate. Before television audiences lock in narratives. But here is the truth. Whatever decision comes out of that room on Wednesday will not end the controversy. It will redefine it. If Mercedes is restricted, the story becomes about lost dominance. If they are cleared, the story becomes about regulatory loopholes. Either way, the 2026 era begins under tension. And the real question now is not whether Mercedes built something clever. It is whether Formula One is ready to decide how clever is too clever. Because once that line is drawn, it will shape every innovation that follows. And if that line is not clear enough, we may not be talking about one meeting in Bahrain. We may be talking about the start of a technological arms race the sport was never supposed to have.